Hi.
Sorry, we're a little
No worries.
late today. How are you?
Good to see you.
Good to see you in person.
Yes.
Okay. Introduction.
You don't have to. You're welcome to.
I mean, I would have.
No, I was gonna
resume.
introduce myself, so that's fine. Yeah.
Are you ready for us to start? I'm so excited to introduce to you Emily Laird Bilek, the granddaughter of our 101-year-old member Peggy Laird and the late John Laird. Many of you know them. Emily is much more than their grandchild, but I do mention it because she's certainly on our mind today on this All Saints Sunday, and John, who is with the Lord in heaven. So as we got to know Emily, she's going to tell you more about her background and what brings her here today, but I'm so excited that we get to have you here today, and thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, thanks for that introduction, and I would say that one of my proudest attributes is being Peggy and John's granddaughter. So if I'm not much more, then I'm still a lot. So yeah, I am Emily Bilek, and I grew up in Ann Arbor. I had the pleasure of, being a townie, and I went away for college and graduate school in St. Louis, Miami. I was really happy to come back in about 2015, and I've been here since. I work in the University of Michigan in the Department of Psychiatry. I'm a clinical psychologist and a faculty member there, and predominantly I work with youth, especially kids with anxiety or OCD, but I have a lot of experience and passion for the wide range of mental health concerns in youth, things like depression, as well as making sure that youth in the community get access to effective mental health care. Today we're going to talk about youth mental health, especially trends that have been emerging in the past 10 to 15 years, some proposed causes of those trends, and what we can potentially do about them. So it probably is familiar to many of you. We have heard from the Surgeon General in 2021 an advisory on youth mental health, concerns about the state of mental health. And these concerns have been, increasing in the media because of trends that had started before the pandemic and then were worsened during the pandemic. We can look at some specific data. I was thinking before I started today that this turns out to be a very graph-heavy talk. You don't really need to see or read all the graphs. I'll walk you through them, but there are a lot. So if we look at anxiety over the past, this is from 2004 to 2018, we see that on the left you see girls, on the right boys. They've all been increasing, especially for girls, and really especially in this window of 2012 to 2015. For depression, we see a similar pattern that for boys, that's the bottom blue line, girls is red, and green is, the average. We see from, this is I think 2005 to 2020, that a steady rise and really a big increase in rate for this one starting in about 2011 and probably continuing until this day. We can look at other indices of mental health like self-harm. We find that rates of self-harm are pretty stable for boys, but for girls really increased in the same window, 2011 to 2015. And then for suicide rates, for this one indice, boys have a higher rate than girls, and again, we're seeing that inflection point in that window of 2011 to 2015 or so. And so some takeaways here is that we know, we just have so much data accumulating that there has been a decline in youth mental health, really starting in about 2010, and that inflection point happening, depending on what index you look at, from 2012 to 2015. In general, for most things we look at, the trend is worse for girls than boys. But we're also not looking at breaking it down by a huge number of other demographic variables or cultural variables that also have an impact on the rates. Today, for the sake of time, we're going to focus on that population level and also sometimes by gender. So what might be some causes of this? My guess is that, again, maybe you've read about this in the news or have your own hypotheses. In let's say 2024, this year, there was a review of articles on youth mental health decline and these trends. And they found 10 articles that really met their criteria to look at. And across them, they all found a decline in youth mental health, and they all proposed several different potential causes. And so you can see here the number of articles that proposed a given cause. So social media was the most frequently mentioned, but we have a range here. We have economic concerns, we have binge drinking, we have actually changes in the diagnostic prevalence. So like, are people just assessing it better and diagnosing it more rather than there actually being a decline? So that was proposed by 4 of the studies. None of these were saying this is the cause and we have data for it, but these are some of the theories that are emerging. We do not have time to look at all of these today, so I picked 3 for us to look at. We'll talk about social media as a potential cause. We'll talk about parental monitoring or parental overprotection or lack of independence in youth. And we'll talk about burnout and stress. So let's jump in. Screen time and social media. This is the one that gets the most press, right? And it feels intuitively like it should be true. So let's look and see if there's data to support it. This is a timeline roughly of when a number of social media platforms became live. And if we really look at 2010 and beyond, that's when the social media platforms that most current youth are using became live. And I'm sure there are many others that I don't even know the names of. These are the ones I recognized. So, and you also see my children as unwilling or willing photo inspiration throughout. So this is my son a few years ago. Hopefully not on social media. Here in this graph, what we see is the number of users on different social media platforms. We don't need to look at the specific social media platforms. What I really want to point out here is that we've got the same window of trend, that the real increase in the number of users on social media was happening around the time of when we're seeing that same increase or decline in youth mental health. What about now? What are teens, what are youth doing on social media or just at all? So this graph you see here is what do teens spend 2 or more hours doing every day? On the far right, you see chores. Only 4.6% of teens said they were doing 2 hours or more of chores per day. And a full 3/4 of teens said they were on social media at least 2 hours a day. Even more than that, 30% of teens said they spend 6 or more hours on social media per day, which maybe is a lot, or maybe you know teens and you think, yeah, that sounds about right. That's not that much. So what could the effect of that be? Why do we care? There are a lot of known risks of social media, and here are some dangers that I've seen in the literature or I've thought about, and maybe you have other ones on your mind as well. But certainly they may access harmful content, right? There could be things that are scary or dangerous to see. For teenage kids, there can be things that influence them to take risky behavior. So there's harmful content related to promoting eating disorders and self-harm and suicidal behaviors. Those are things that we don't want our kids seeing, and they are often on social media. Teens and youth have the capacity to be the receiving end of unwanted contact. A study of teen girls found that 50% of girls said that they had been on Instagram or Snapchat and been contacted by a stranger in a way that made them uncomfortable. So we know that on especially these public social media platforms, there's a chance that a lot of kids could be negatively sort of contacted. And relatedly, privacy concerns. Lots of these social media apps have location services you can turn on, so you can show your friends where you are, or other people can see where you are. That's scary, that people could just know where you are. And it also has implications for social interactions. We find that a lot of kids feel social exclusion because they see all their friends hanging out and they're at home. Online harassment is an issue. So there's bullying that happens in the schools, in the neighborhoods, and there's just more access to that online. We found that, I was not a part of the study, but there's been research to show that for Black youth, they may experience racial stigmatization or discrimination online at least every day. So there is a fair amount of danger of cyberbullying, cyber harassment, things like that. And then if we're thinking about 6+ hours spent a day online, that has to come at the expense of something else, right? We don't just automatically get 6 extra hours in our day. So what are teens sacrificing if they're spending time online? They're becoming less physically active. They are spending less time in person with social contacts. And really the big one is they give up sleep for it, right? I think there was a study that showed that 41% of teens reported that being on social media, especially TikTok, I think was a study, interfered with their sleep at least one night per week, and a full quarter said every night in the past week it interrupted their sleep. Beyond that, we know, aside from just those direct consequences, there can be downstream consequences. We alluded to this already. If you're seeing harmful content, that can be scary, that can be disturbing, but can also make you more likely to engage in that harmful content. If you are experiencing a lot of like the idealized beauty standards that can be on Instagram or Snapchat, any of these platforms, that can take a hit to to self-esteem, and can bring youth to rely more on external validation rather than things that are inside of them. Certainly, if we're spending more time interacting online and we aren't interacting in person, that can lead some youth to experience social isolation. And then the downstream impacts of losing sleep, losing physical activity, not having social connections. There are mental health consequences of all of those things. That said, not everything about social media is bad. And according to a 2022 Pew Research poll, the majority of respondents, these were parents and teens, felt that social media helps teenagers feel more accepted, feel like they have people who can support them through tough times, feel like they have a place to go to show their creative side, and that they're more connected to what's going on with their friends' lives. So there are significant true benefits that can come from social media. If I can't see my friends, they live far away, I can connect with them online and have that real connection. And there's some research that shows that an online friendship, one that only exists online, has the same benefits as a friendship in real life. So that can be counted as a real friend. Community and connection, especially for isolated teens or teens who have, sort of an identity that isn't accepted by their family, or they're just have an interest that's more rare. Like if I'm really into like building dioramas and none of my friends are into that, I can find a niche online. There are people who do that. I can take classes online, I can go to YouTube and learn how to do it better, and then I can connect with people who like the same thing that I do. And that brings me to education. There is, an amazing amount of really high quality educational videos online. This is a screenshot from a show called Crash Course, which is tons and tons of really high quality science content online for free. And I hear that some high schools, the teachers use videos from this to help teach their classes, but teens can go on and learn about their interests whenever they want. So there are good things about social media. There are drawbacks. What does the research say about the relationship between the two? So this study, or this graph here shows us the amount of time on the bottom that someone spends on screens more broadly, and then their depression score. So higher scores indicate more depression. And we find that in general, more time leads to higher depression scores, and especially true for girls. Two things I want to note about this is that we can't say for sure that the screen time is causing the depression, because depressed teens might be more likely to spend more time on social media or on screens in general. And I also want to notice that the slope of the graphs, the amount that it increases, it's pretty slow until you get to about 3 hours, and then it pretty dramatically increases. So we're going to talk about that there are just these general trends that make us think that social media, that screen time may be bad for youth, but it seems like there's also some individual level trends or individual factors that are really important to consider when we think about, is social media going to have a negative impact? So some individual level factors to consider. One is age. This graph is a little hard to read. Higher means more well-being or better mental health, lower means worse. And this is showing age at which someone got their first cell phone. And this is someone like reflecting back on it. So I think this data is not the best to look at, but it demonstrates something that we've seen in other research studies as well, that the younger you are when you get a phone or when you engage on social media, probably the more of an impact it will have on your mental health. So age is a factor that we care about. Amount of use matters. For kids under 15, especially girls under 15, probably more use is worse. But we find in like the 16 to 19 range that no use is worse than a little bit of use. And of course, I'm sure that's individualized as well, but kids' lives are online. And if one child doesn't have access to that, one teen doesn't have access to that, they are missing out on some social benefits. And so a low amount of use in that age range, I think it's like 1 to 3 hours, can confer some benefit. And then above that, that's when you saw in that last graph, above 3 hours is when it tends to get worse. And gender, unfortunately, in general, the impact of social media is worse for girls than boys. There's also a impact of the type of content. Then this makes sense when we think about it. Not all social media is created equal. It's not all going to have a negative impact. So at the top of this graph, we're going to look at items that are like social media behaviors or social media like related factors that are associated with more worse mental health outcomes. And at the bottom are either neutral or just like a little bit worse mental health outcomes, because 0 is that left-hand line. And this is way too hard to read, so don't worry about reading it. But at the top, we have things like being cyberbullied. Of course, if you're cyberbullied, that's going to have a negative impact. So that's probably the biggest predictor. But other things like having a private social media account where it's like a fake social media account, a secret one. Private is not the word I mean. Private can be good, but a secret one is affiliated with like worse outcomes, and when parents expect that they have a secret one, and problematic behavior of like trying to hide it from your parents is associated with worse. Better outcomes or not as bad outcomes are things like using messaging apps. So really, if I am texting with a friend, that is social connection, and it's a person that I know, and it's probably not me posting pictures trying to get a lot of likes. So there can be more benefit to that rather than downside. Also, video gaming with friends tends to have less negative effects. So to take away from this section, there are both possible benefits and risks associated with use of social media and screen time. In general, especially after a threshold, more use is associated with worse mental health, but there are individual differences. Youth are more vulnerable, especially at young ages. Girls are more vulnerable than boys. Certain types of behaviors online are more dangerous than others. Okay, so that was social media. We're going to move on to lack of independence. So this is we're going to talk about parenting here. A recent poll of caregivers asked caregivers about their parenting style. 20% said that they felt like they gave their children too much freedom. 35% said they weren't too protective or too much freedom, and about 45% said they were overprotective. And this is self-reporting of it. So we'll talk in a minute why this might even be underrepresenting it, but it's almost a half of parents feeling like they are overprotecting their youth. So we're going to explore this parenting phenomenon and how it may relate to youth mental health. But first, I want you to take a moment to think about your own childhood. And if you can, think back to one of your best, most cherished memories from childhood. You can think where you were, what you were doing, were any adults present. And if you have something in mind, maybe you can reflect on, like, do you think children today would be allowed to do that same thing, and why or why not? Does anyone have one they want to share? Yeah.
Yeah, my parents allowed me to pretty much be on my own, but let me know what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it could be as easy now because of the risk to the kids from predators.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's exactly right. Most people say, especially if they grew up in the 80s or earlier, that their cherished memories are being in nature without other parents around, maybe at a creek, maybe like climbing something dangerous, or like making up a game with their friends. I remember being at a camp which there were definitely adult supervision, but all of the wonderful activities this camp had, me and my friends didn't want anything to do with that, and we wanted to go find a sort of like wooded area and build trails in it, because it was something that we felt like we were independent and we were doing, and it just felt so fun. And you know, there's been so many changes that have happened where expectations on parents have fundamentally changed, right? There's this real safety concern that comes up, which means that often parents feel like they must be monitoring their child, paying attention to their child all the time, or else they could be in danger, or as a parent, they are a bad parent. So here we see my son, because I want to be independence granting, exploring a creek. And here I am, just about 10 feet away, looking afraid and worried about it. Mostly because we were on a road trip and I was really afraid he was going to get all wet and then be miserable for the rest of the trip. But really, it's much harder these days to let kids roam free the way that they used to. So why does parenting look different these days? What is different about being a kid, about being a parent? We know that adults have fewer children than they used to. Parents engage in this more intensive parenting. Number of single-parent households has increased, and mothers are much more likely to be full-time employed than they used to. And this coincided with that aforementioned cultural shift, where the expectation is that children spend more time with parents than they did. And so children have less autonomy, independence, and responsibility. Let's look at that, see if there's any data. This was harder to find, like where are the graphs that show me that kids are less independent over time? We can look at walking to school. In 1969, almost 50% of kids, this is like K through 8th grade, would walk or bike to school. And then that really dropped in the 90s. And now it's around 10 or 11% of kids. What about responsibility? This is percent of teens who have a job. It was hovering between 50 and 60% until it looks like about 2000, and then it has really tapered off, and now it's somewhere between 30 and 40%. So kids are having fewer opportunities to do things on their own, to get that physical exercise outside, to get those physical enjoyments of nature, and they are having less opportunities to build that responsibility that comes from having a job, also that independence from earning some money, things like that. But why does this matter? So I think there's a lot of benefits of youth independence. Imagining myself in this wooded area back when I was like maybe 9, what happens if like someone falls and twists their ankle a little bit? We have to work as kids to like problem solve a little bit, figure out how to get that kid back up to camp. Teaches responsibility. You know, I have to observe the situation for risk and make some decisions versus offloading all that responsibility to my parent who's always watching me, who's going to tell me when it's safe and when it's dangerous. I build self-efficacy. When I am climbing a tree and it's hard and I do it, and I was a little bit scared, but I do it, I build confidence. I can do hard things. An example that one of these authors gave was that parents are trying now to give more autonomy because they understand it's so important. So a mom let her kid go ride, I think, to the creek on her bike, not too far from their house. But then on the way, her daughter got a flat tire. Thank goodness she had an Apple Watch. She could call Dad. Dad came, took her home. That's not exactly the opportunity to build problem solving, right? Like if I don't have that phone, then I have to figure out how am I going to get this bike home? And it's not the end of the world. It will take me longer, but I'll figure it out. And those are the problem solving skills that maybe kids are missing when Dad understandably swoops in and comes and brings the kid home. It builds social skills when kids play without adult oversight or intervention. They're coming up with their own games, they're coming up with their own rules, they're negotiating when their rules don't align. Maybe they're roughhousing and someone gets a little bit hurt, and then they are trying to figure out how do we move forward. I still want to have fun and play, so I'm not going to completely decompensate like I might if mom were here, right? There's a lot of skills that can be built. What about this last one? Teaches healthy risk-taking. I would say, as a parent who tries to offer my children more independence, this is a picture of the first time that I told them they could walk home from school alone. And they took off. And I was like, I gotta get a picture of this. They want independence, right? And as a parent, I worry. But actually, healthy risk-taking has a lot of benefits too, because kids, they love to, what do they love to do? They love to go fast. They love to climb. They want to go high. They want to roughhouse. They want to do these things that are a little bit risky. And kids can and do get injured when they do this. And in rare events, of course, yes, sometimes kids die from, reasonable risk-taking. But what happens when they do get to do this risk-taking, a lot of those other things that we talked about, they start to know the boundaries of their own competence. They're more likely to say, look at a scene and say like, oh, this is risky. Versus if I don't have that, I'm relying on someone else to tell me what's risky. They're learning those boundaries for themselves. Other types of things that can come from risk-taking are social skills again. Like if you're fighting with another child, you know not to go too far because you are trying to have a good time. So they have studied rats. Apparently rats need risk-taking play as well. And when they deprive rats of risk-taking play, they end up if they meet like a same-aged peer, a little rat their own age that they don't know, they are either aggressive or fearful around that rat because they don't know how to interact with these rats in like that roughhousing way where you get to know them and then you build those social skills. Whereas the rats who had done risky play met a new rat, they had like a more appropriate response. So we can think of our kids who are so anxious, myself included, my own kids, part of that might be because they're not having these chances to build that own internalized sense of, I know what my boundaries are, I know how to navigate tough situations, and what I always come back to is like, I can do hard things. Of course, we don't want them to do really dangerous things, right? And so it's also about teaching kids how to assess risk, which is a skill that will be helpful in their lifetime. So this is a harder one to study. Again, I looked, there isn't any that I could find direct study looking at autonomy and how it impacts mental health. So we're going to have to look at some things that might sort of suggest it. We believe, and there's research to show that when youth have more autonomy, they have a more internalized locus of control. Internalized or externalized locus of control are fancy ways of talking about like how much you feel like you can do something. My internal locus of control, I believe that I have power in my world. I can problem solve. I can create outcomes. Whereas external, it sort of feels like everything is happening to me. And we don't want a child to always feel an internal locus of control. If there's a hurricane, I don't want a child to think, well, that was my fault, right? But in general, like viewing your world as somewhere where you have agency is associated with better mental health. And we think that this would potentially be the sort of the sequence of events. If I have autonomy, then I'm going to build a more internal locus of control. I'm going to believe that things I do have an impact, and that's going to lead to mental well-being. And research suggests that autonomy is associated with internal locus of control, and some research suggests that internal locus of control is associated with mental well-being. So we have to connect the dots there. This graph here also shows over our, historical timeline how over time child locus of control has gotten increasingly external, which kind of goes along with the same idea that we're seeing. They just feel less like they have the problem-solving ability to engage, to influence their environment. All right, and so the takeaways from this section is that there are benefits to autonomy, to independence, but there's been so many cultural and structural changes that have reduced parental autonomy granting since about 80s or 90s. And this impact of this has really compounded with social media, because if I don't have independence and I have to stay at home, I'll be on social media more probably. So this leads to more screen time, and this can have a negative impact on youth. I'm looking at the time. It's 11:30. I know that some people may have to leave. Would this be a good time for me to pause? I can open up for any questions that have come up so far. Yeah.
I'm curious, when I look at the graphs, girls have a more difficult time than boys, yet when you look at suicides, it's on boys. So can you explain the difference there?
Yeah. It's actually quite sad. It's that boys are more likely to pick lethal means when they attempt suicide. So they are more likely to complete suicide. Boys are more likely to use guns. whereas girls may attempt suicide, but they are more likely to use pills or other things, which you can die by suicide, but you may have a better chance of being saved. Yeah.
I have a question related to that. So I have 2 boys, and I know my friends who have girls, their girls talk a lot.
Yeah.
And my boys don't talk a lot.
Yeah.
And is that like a communication or support thing related to that? That why boys, they don't ask or seek help, so they go directly to suicide?
Yeah, I mean, that could very well be the case. So the question was, are girls more like emotionally connected and asking for help more often than boys who might hold it inside and wait until things are so bad and then, maybe do something much more drastic? I think that is one theory for how it plays out. I do think that there tends to be more stigma for boys seeking help than girls. I do think that some of these trends with depression persist, even if we sort of send boys and girls to therapy. It's maybe it still has something to do with their upbringing, but there's something about puberty that seems to be associated with depression for girls. And also, I think some of the pressures that are put on young women around that time. I think if we look at a graph of when depression really spikes for girls, it is right around ages 13 to 15. And as puberty has been starting younger and younger, we've also started to see that depression move younger and younger. And maybe if you saw in that graph in terms of hypothesized reasons why the trends are getting worse for youth mental health, one of them is about earlier menarche for girls. Yeah.
I think you mentioned that's important is the concept of boundaries, and that what you're pointing out is that parental autonomy for granting this appears to be so much less. The question is, how can parents be now helped with the skills in developing boundaries, particularly when it relates to the use of internet, social media, and so on?
Perfect. So that is something I'm going to get into really quickly. That is the end of my talk, is like, what can parents and loved ones do, both to have appropriate boundaries around screen time and also to support youth autonomy. So we will get there shortly. The one thing I want to say is that it's no one parent's fault, I'm saying this to myself, that parents are overprotective. I think that in the 90s, especially late 80s to 90s, there were some very high profile cases of kidnapping that really changed the culture around parenting. It really made it seem like instead of, I can let my kids go out in public, other grown-ups are there to support my kids, it became actually everyone's a threat. And the only way I know my kids can be safe is if I'm the one monitoring them. It turns out that was way overblown. Over the course of 15 years, when there was this really big concern about predators, it turned out there was only 150 cases in all of the United States, which sounds like a lot, but is incredibly low percentage-wise. And yet, it's hard to walk back. And since then, there's sort of been this like parenting arms race where I am considered a better parent if I am investing more in my child, if I am more present, if I pay more attention, and if I get them in more activities. That is how I signal to the world that I'm a good parent. And if I let my kid walk home from school and someone comes up to them and says, "Where's your mother?" which has happened to my children, that reflects badly on me. So I think it's really hard to, as an individual, totally walk that back, although I do have some suggestions. Yeah.
It seems to me like the social media plays a bigger role in a sense. My parents had to deal with the Depression, World War II, and the Korean War. That's a lot more stressful than I think than the external today. My generation had to deal, and I would recommend looking at CNN's the 1960s. We had the Vietnam. We had the racial issues, riots all over, Birmingham, etc. That's a lot of stress.
Yeah.
I think, but we didn't have to deal with the issues of social media.
Yeah.
No, also, the parents pushed the kids to do things rather than brought them in. There weren't many helicopter parents back then.
Exactly.
And finally, with our kids, whether it was right or wrong, we did push them. Each one of them had a job in high school. each one of them was in sports in high school. Now each had a auto, so they were had autonomy in that regard. They didn't have the social media that the kids have now, but what they did have, they used, but they used what I would say more selectively.
Mm-hmm.
But I think pushing the kids to what you showed there, jobs, sports, etc. You can fill that 6-hour time with other things if you. That's what I see it. And there's more with my parents or with me. If you ask for or needed mental health help, there was a stigma to that.
Right.
Now the stigma is not to that, but avoiding getting the help, which I think is. So I think you're also seeing more reporting because it makes it better to say I need help than it did then. I know I needed help. I didn't get it because of the stigma.
Right. Right. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I think that, a lot of what you're saying there aligns with that graph of what the hypothesized causes were, is that stigma is a big one, more diagnosis is a big one, autonomy, and social media. So all right, I'm going to move quickly through stress and burnout so that we can talk about the possible solutions that we could have. Essentially, what we're finding, this is a very recent report that just came out in October that said that about a quarter of youth reported being burned out, and many, many more reported having one or more stressors. So here are the stressors that they talked about. Things like pressure to have a plan as a teenager. This is more like older teenagers, pre-college. Pressure to achieve, pressure to look a certain way, pressure to have a specific kind of social life, the right, cool kind of social life, pressure to always be available to friends, and also pressure to be an activist, to care a lot about a lot of things and show that you care. In general, we find that girls experience more pressure than boys, or report more pressure across all of those domains, especially in appearance, and that most social media platforms, that's what you see on the blue graph, are associated with high amounts of appearance pressure. This is a study, this graph on the right is a study of Swedish adolescents, and found that academic pressure and stress have been increasing in recent decades. So before 2009, sort of up and down, but since 2009, academic pressure was going up, and as usual, the impact on well-being is especially prominent for girls. On the left-hand side, you can see that pressure doesn't come from just one place. It's not just parents or just teachers. Students are also reporting a lot of pressure coming from themselves and pressure from their peers. Now, the question is, does this lead to worse mental health? There is a very strongly documented relationship between burnout and depression, but it's hard to say which comes first, right? If I'm depressed, am I more likely to be easily burnt out? And I think that's probably true. But there was one study that showed that if you look at different times, depression leads to depression, burnout leads to burnout, but burnout also predicts depression. So there is some impact of burnout leading to worse mental health outcomes. And so these are our takeaways here, that to some extent, at least, there is some research showing that school stress, other types of stress are increasing, and that this is worse for girls than boys. Social media probably, again, is sort of like contributing, making it worse, and that it's related to depression. So what about solutions? We've talked about a lot of different causes. A lot of the things that might change these situations for youth are at a structural level, right? It's not up to you or me to ban social media for all teens. We can't do that. But we can think about what individual level things, what individual changes we might be able to make that might make some difference. So what can we do? If we talk about social media and parenting, there's some research that shows different types of parenting behaviors are associated with more screen use versus less screen use. So if I model using the phone, if I'm texting at dinner time, or if I'm just using it while I'm having a conversation, my kids are more likely to use more. If I use it at bedtime or allow it at bedtime, my kids are more likely to use more. If I monitor, if I have a expectation and limit setting around social media that is well known and there's like a consistent expectation, that's associated with less. But it's not quite that simple as just limiting it. So here on the right, we show how the relationship with parents and the monitoring or limit setting is related to social media and mental health. So the blue line is poor mental health, so higher is worse mental health, and the green line is more than 5 hours of screen time per day. And you can have low monitoring but a strong relationship, and there's still a fair amount of use and bad, sort of like poor mental health. You can have high monitoring and it's sort of a weak relationship with your child, and that's not good. The best outcomes were for high monitoring. I'm really keeping an eye and I have consistent expectations, but we also have a strong relationship. A quote from this survey, which was in 2023, said, "Screen time has no association with an index of mental health problems for teens who demonstrate high levels of self-control and enjoy a strong relationship with parents who supervise them." So thinking about how that might influence teens, like coming up with, and I'll talk about this in a second, coming up with a family media plan and then putting it somewhere where everyone can see, collaboratively developing that and sticking to it, and everyone is expected to stick to it. Okay, what about independence? Again, we can't just change the fact that if I let my kid go out more independently, parents will, adults will question them. There are a lot of ways, though, that you can foster healthy independence. Thinking about, this is maybe for younger kids than our teens, but I do think that there are ways to apply it to teens as well. Thinking about what skills you want them to learn and giving them a chance to do it with the proper support to keep it safe, but independent, and giving them chances for problem solving. So an example from my family is that recently we will take the kids, my kids are 5 and 7, take them to the grocery store, tell them 1 or 2 things we want them to buy, give them money, and say they can pick out 1 thing for themselves. And then they go into the store, they do all the shopping, they come out with it. One time they went and tried to do the self-checkout, but the self-checkout is only for credit card, and someone just told them, no, you can't do that here, go do cash, right? And they figured it out, it was fine. We want to encourage this unstructured play. Sports are great, but too much time in structured sports with parents or with adults deprives kids from that opportunity to make up the rules, to negotiate the rules. It's coming more top down. So we want to balance that out with these opportunities for them to negotiate, to figure it out, to be the ones determining how far they go. There's research that shows that actually youth injuries have gone up since engagement in structured sports have gone up. Kids aren't getting injured because we let them play by themselves. They're getting injured because coaches push them too hard. We also show that for academic stress, engaging in specific types of self-care can really prevent burnout. So self-care isn't like having a bath and painting my toenails. It is getting enough sleep. It is spending time with other people, helping people in your community. It's spending time in nature. So kids who engaged in 6 or more of these per week had the lowest rates of burnout. Granted, if you're doing this, that means you're not doing something else. It means that you're not studying 10 hours for your algebra test, right? So what can we do as loved ones? We can validate and empathize when we hear from teens that, or in some cases, your kindergartner, that school is very stressful. You can empathize with it rather than minimizing it. I don't actually think my child's kindergarten class is stressful, but I'm going to hear her and I'm going to tell her that's really hard for you, right? I'm empathizing with it and maybe doing some problem solving with her. I'm going to reorient my values. Like, is it so important to me? Is it more important to me that my kids get straight A's? Or is it more important to me that they become adults who believe they can do hard things? And sometimes you can't have both, right? And so you can have the getting straight A's as maybe the secondary priority if that's true for you. But for me, I try to believe, and maybe don't ask me in 10 years, but that when my kids graduate high school and they're getting C's, that if they have learned along the way that when they see a challenge, they can go through it, that they are going to face their challenges, that to me will feel like a bigger win. And if I'm encouraging self-care, I have to recognize that it might come at the expense of spending time focusing on grades. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about achievement, but it just means we have to sometimes think about what our priorities are. We have to model healthy behaviors, the ones that we want our kids to do. We have to believe that they are watching us and learning more from what we do than what we say, and protect free time and prioritize play. You can build a family media plan like I described before. This is available on the American Academy of Pediatrics website, and it's really well recommended. You can go to TechnoSapiens blog. That is one of my very favorite resources and gave me a lot of the content for today's talk because it really makes it accessible to parents, to grandparents, even to teens to understand the research that's out there about social media and how to make sense of it, what to do. And Let Grow is a really cool nonprofit that is all about getting kids to be more independent. They have these badges that you can print for your child that maybe I should do for my kids that say, yes, my parent knows I'm doing this. I'm allowed to do this. I'm not allowed to go with strangers, but I'm allowed to talk to them. And here's my mom's phone number if you are concerned. I also have this book that I think was recommended on the Let Grow website or somewhere else where I was researching, which is 50 Dangerous Things You Should Let Your Children Do. And it's about like learning how to use power tools and building things that might make us anxious, but give them a chance to build skills and be more confident in what they're doing. So if there's one thing you remember today, it's that children need the freedom and time to play. Play is not a luxury, play is a necessity. And that's it. Thank you. We can take more questions? Sure. Yeah. Here, I saw you first.
Thanks, Emily. This is a very illuminating talk, and I really appreciate the things that you've represented, not only the problems, but the nature of what individuals can do. But you also mentioned that there are obviously limits to what we can do in terms of structure. And there's a lot of experimentation now. I honestly don't know if it's happening in the Ann Arbor schools, of essentially saying that kids check in their cell phones when they come into the school and check them out at the end of the day, which in my mind intuitively sort of enforces interactions, enforces looking at other opportunities to engage, whether it's a structured sports or not. But I don't know what data exists yet to support that that's actually making a difference. Is there data yet out there, and what's your current take on that?
Great question. So there is a little data. It's so new that there hasn't been a lot of chance to do research on it. But I think it was in Germany, there was a review of the limited research that's been done that shows there is a modest benefit to cell phone bans in school. It showed that the benefit is actually better for social outcomes than for academic outcomes. That really my take of that is really what is hurt by having cell phones in schools is the social interaction like you're talking about. There's other research that shows for even younger kids, like 4th through 8th grade, if you take away their phones at recess, they engage in more physical play, which makes, of course, intuitive sense, but that's data to support it. Michigan has a bill up for committee right now, I think, suggesting cell phone bans in schools, and I plan to contact my representatives and support it. I would love for Ann Arbor to do that. Yeah.
This isn't much a question, but an affirmation of what you're saying about play. When I was teaching back in my younger days at U of M, I taught a recreation course in recreation planning. And I based the whole course on one idea, one question: what is fun? You would be amazed how adults have no idea what fun is. and so then I got a chance later in life to have grandchildren. And there were twins, and they were like 3 years old. And I invented a slogan, and the slogan was this: danger is our business. And these kids, but it was, when you did that, you had to watch to make sure that they weren't, and they would do things like walking along a curb and balancing, and safe, what we would consider safe things, but I think, and as you grow older, you forget how to play. You're so damn serious about everything, and you need to laugh.
This is more a thought, but I know this is not a religious presentation, but it makes me think as we were talking what role our faith, the church, the role that we play here, as we've been doing things like having children in worship with us now. They don't go off in the middle of the service and don't come back again. It's a tax on us in some ways to keep our children involved or engaged, but the way that that speaks into what you're talking about here, that we're giving them skills and giving them a play, in a sense, in a relationship there. But what role the church plays as they get older in terms of like mission trips and youth groups and all those things that folks like me did that were, you didn't have your cell phone, you don't have your cell phone on a mission trip. You might have it there, but you're not going to be looking at it and things like that. So I think that's something that our Christian formation program can talk about coming out of this presentation is there are churches in town where everything is on screens and there's praise bands and screens everywhere, and it's just very technology focused. And I wonder what the outcomes would be, might be different here with a more traditional kind of approach than some of those. Just a thought.
Yeah, and just to your point about having the children in services with you, I think that one of the things I found with the structural changes over the decades was that it became less okay to have children in public spaces. Children needed their own separate space. They were not allowed to misbehave in public and things like that. And so I think this idea of allowing children to be in all the spaces that grown-ups are, that people are, that helps them learn important skills. And I think it also helps grown-ups remember, like, what is normative in kids. I think that's great.
Yes.
You talked about the difficulty and the challenges of working with the kids, working it out with other kids. Not enough attention, in my opinion, it talks about coping and resilience. Right. And I was wondering how you work with schools on coping and resilience and what they're doing.
Are you a plant? What I do personally, so I work with a nonprofit that is based in Ann Arbor, but actually is national, called TRAILS, which is Transforming Research into Action to Improve the Lives of Students. You don't need to know that. But if you are interested, you can check out their website, which is trailstowellness.org. And this program is all about getting effective mental health skills into schools. And they have more traditional sort of therapy skills, but they also have social emotional learning, which is all about coping skills, resilience. It's about teaching every student in the school things about learning what emotions are so that you can differentiate between them. I'm not just always mad. Sometimes I'm jealous. Sometimes I'm tired, right? And knowing the difference between emotions can really have a very big impact in knowing which skills to use, knowing when to ask for help, and also which behaviors I engage in. Not everything becomes, nail when if all you have is a hammer. So that is the one way that I specifically work with schools. Is I give a lot of trainings to school counselors, other mental health professionals, social workers, about what are effective strategies for helping kids learn to cope, and trying to get that as nationally as we can.
Well, we want to thank you so much for being here. I know you're coming back in February.
Yes.
On a Monday night as a part of the Compassion and Care series. So it's a related topic. I can't right now in the back of my mind.
OCD.
On OCD, yes. And that is going to be a wonderful presentation as well. But thank you for spending your time with us today. We have a beautiful candle to thank you for your time that we can light, and we'll remember our time here today with you. But thank you all for being here, and we'll see you in February.
Yes.
as well.
Thanks for having me.